Welcome, everybody. So good to have you here today on each and every campus as we continue this teaching series entitled Ordinary Joe. But before we jump in, I just got to say one more time, how about our students? That is awesome, isn't it? I mean, it's great to see that kind of thing happen. And that's one of the things I love about my church is the fact that our kids get to experience that kind of thing each and every week around here. Well, today we're on week number 3 in this teaching series entitled Ordinary Joe. We're talking about the story of a man named Joseph, whose story is told in the book of Genesis. But as a way of introducing what we're going to talk about today, I want to tell you a story that comes from my own family. It's something that happened in my family about 12 years ago, and we still laugh about it and still talk about it even 12 years later. But it was Christmas time, and we were planning to spend some time with my parents in Wisconsin. So on Christmas Eve, after I had finished up with our Christmas Eve services, we got in the car and started driving to Wisconsin. We were going to drive all night long because our kids were young and we wanted them to sleep through the night. Our kids were about 5 and 1 at the time. So we left about 7 o'clock on Christmas Eve in the evening, and I had neglected to fill up the gas tank that day. So we're going down the highway, and I get about 3 hours from home, and I look at the gas tank and gas gauge, and the tank is starting to get kind of close, so I mentally calculate how much gas we still have and how far that'll take me. And I travel Interstate 80. We're on Interstate 80, and I travel that all the time, so I know where the good places are to stop. And I knew that just up ahead, we could get off the exit at Clarion. And that would be a good spot to get gas because there's like 3 big gas stations there and, fast food restaurants and a hotel, and it's like right off the exit. It's not one of those where you see the sign for gas and you get off and it's 20 miles. Well, I knew at Clarion it was all right there off the exit. So I'm almost to the exit, and my wife wakes up. She had been sleeping. And she looks over and she says, "Honey, do you realize the gas is getting kind of low?" And I said, yeah, I know that. And she said, well, it may not be a good idea to let it get quite that low when it's 20 degrees outside at 11 o'clock on Christmas Eve. And of course, she was exactly right, but I didn't want to admit that. So I said, oh, don't worry about it. It's okay, because we're going to get off the exit right up here at Clarion, and they got big old gas stations there, and we're going to be fine, trust me. Like, family leader has it all under control. And so I get to the exit, we get off, and come around a bend, I look up ahead, and it's like a ghost town. Everything is closed. Everything is closed except the hotel. And so at this point, the tension level in the vehicle rose just a notch or two. And it was about this time that this little light on the instrument panel came on in the shape of a gas pump. You ever seen one of those lights? Do you remember what they call those lights on the instrument panel? Yeah, it's an idiot light, which about that time felt fairly appropriate. So I did the only thing I could do. I pulled into the hotel. I go in and talk to the desk clerk, and I said, is there a gas station around here anywhere that is open? And he said, well, there is a mini mart down in downtown Clarion. It's just a few miles away. He said, normally they're open 24 hours, but it is Christmas Eve, sir, which I already knew. So I figured, you know what, I've got to take my chances, either that or stay in a hotel 3.5 hours from home on Christmas Eve. So we drove down into Clarion to the mini mart, and sure enough, thank goodness, it was open. So I pull up to the gas pump and I fill the tank with gas, and I get finished filling the tank with gas, and I'm about to go inside to pay. And before I did, I said to my wife, I said to Debbie, when I go inside, is there anything that you need me to buy? And she said something that I'll never forget, and we still laugh about it today. And she wasn't being mean. She said it with a smile on her face. She said, yeah, while you're in there, why don't you see if you can buy some common sense? And all the wives said, amen, amen, yeah. And we still laugh about that. We still joke about it today. But wouldn't it be great if it were that easy? I mean, wouldn't it be great if you could just send your husband into the mini mart to buy some common sense or some integrity or some wisdom? See, it doesn't work that way in life, does it? See, character never comes from a convenience store. In life, the way we usually get character is through the pain and the struggles and the difficulty of life. That's almost always the way that we develop character. And we're going to see that today in the story of Joseph, this man who is just really an ordinary Joe. So let me encourage you to take the white bulletin insert out, and the passage is there along with a place to write down some notes and some things that you may want to remember and reflect on in this coming week. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 40 as we continue this story, but before we jump in there, let me go back and do a little bit of review from last week. Last week, Mark Fitch covered chapter 39, did an awesome job, and he talked about temptation and about how we need to flee, not flirt, when it comes to temptation. And by the way, on Tuesday, he showed up at the office with enough Krispy Kreme donuts for the entire staff. And you won't know why that's funny unless you were here last week. But great message, and he talked about this powerful, powerful temptation that Joseph experienced because he was being propositioned by his boss's wife, not just one time, but over and over and over again. But Joseph doesn't give in. In fact, he says no repeatedly, and then eventually he just turns and he runs. Here's where we left off last week, chapter 39, verse 10. It says, "And though she, Potiphar's wife, spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, 'Come to bed with me.'" And this is what we call the direct approach. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. I mean, this is amazing. Incredible self-control, incredible respect for his boss, for his master. And you would think at this point, God would say, "Okay, Joseph, you have done so well, I'm going to bless you," right? And you read this and you think, come on, God, pour it on. Pour out your reward upon this man for being such a man of conviction. But look what happens next, verse 16. "She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home," that was Potiphar. "Then she told him this story, 'That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house.' When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, 'This is how your slave treated me,' he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined." And it's like, you've got to be kidding. Joseph gets punished for the very thing he had the self-control not to do. I mean, here's a guy who shows amazing restraint and amazing integrity, and he should have been rewarded for it, and the exact opposite happens. I mean, this is one of those moments in life, and maybe you've had a moment like this, where you just want to throw up your hands and say, "I give up. All right, I've tried being good. I've prayed. I've followed the straight and narrow path. Look where it got me. Forget it." I mean, Joseph easily could have felt that way, because think about what Joseph had experienced. First of all, he experienced in his life disappointment with his circumstances. I mean, the guy gets thrown in a pit at the age of 17, then he gets sold as a slave. Now he finds himself in prison. His circumstances were terrible. In fact, it said here in verse 20 that this was the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And then you read a little bit later in chapter 40 and you discover that this prison was actually inside the house of Potiphar, the guy that Joseph used to work for. And so Joseph in his cell could probably hear all the activities and all the festivities of this household that he used to oversee. And so he's in these circumstances that are completely unfair. But it was not only the difficult circumstances in his life, it was the difficult people in his life. Think of all the people in his life who had disappointed him. All the disappointments he had faced. He grew up in a family where his brothers hated him. They literally wanted to kill him, and the only thing that stopped them from killing him was the fact that they found a chance to sell him. And then he gets to Potiphar's house, and things begin looking up, and then this woman to whom he showed the utmost dignity, who he treated with the utmost dignity, falsely accuses him. And then the guy Potiphar, who should have looked into it to see if there was any truth to this, just automatically believes it and throws him in prison. I mean, every single person in Joseph's life has disappointed him deeply. But here's the thing. When you experience disappointment with circumstances and disappointment with people, and you experience that long enough and enough times, eventually you get to the point where you're just disappointed with life. And you just become bitter. And you wallow in self-pity, and you just become cynical and sarcastic, and you just decide, you know what, life just stinks. It really stinks for me. And if you get disappointed with your circumstances and with people, and eventually get disappointed with life, and if you live there long enough, eventually you'll be disappointed with God. And you'll say, "God, I don't even know if you're there anymore. And if you are there, you certainly don't care about me." because look at where I am. And some of you know this because you have followed this path in your own life. And the only way to avoid this downward spiral of disappointment is to begin with one assumption, to begin with one conviction, that no matter what, God is with you, that He hasn't forsaken you, He hasn't abandoned you, because this is the promise of Scripture in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5. God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. And so what we have to do every day is we have to choose how we're going to live. See, I can make decisions based on my circumstances and the people who've disappointed me. Or I can make decisions based on the strongly held conviction that God is with me, and choose to live life that way. And this was the secret to Joseph's life. This is the point of his whole story, that Joseph did what any ordinary person would do who was confident that God is with him. He just did what any ordinary person would do in every situation who is confident that God is with him. And God was with him, even there in prison. Verse 20, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. And Joseph knew that God was with him. And because he knew that God was with him, it changed the way that Joseph responded to his circumstances. And because he knew that God was with him, he did not waste his time in prison. He used that time in prison to continue becoming the man that God wanted him to be as he kept his eyes on God. I want to tell you three things that Joseph gained from his time in prison. Number one, stronger character. Verse 20, but while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So get this. Instead of becoming bitter, Joseph decides to keep his eyes on God, make the best of a bad situation. He works hard, he's honest, he shows integrity, and here's what happens. Verse 22, so the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Let me tell you something. You are a person of character when you're in jail and the warden gives you your own set of keys. That's when you know that you're trusted. So in spite of his disappointment with people and circumstances in life, Joseph does not become bitter and cynical and depressed, which he easily could have done. Because as far as he knew, this was the end of the road, right? See, he doesn't get to read ahead in his own story to see if he ever gets out of jail. As far as he knew, he was going to be there for the rest of his life. And this was hopeless, and this was pointless. But I want you to understand something, that his time in prison was not pointless, because what was happening there in prison is that his character was being changed. Because you got to remember, like we talked about 2 weeks ago, Joseph had a dream. And he had a dream that he would someday be a great leader. And that was God's plan for Joseph. But see, Joseph had been raised in a home that did not prepare him well for leadership, because he was a spoiled, pampered, favorite son. And so before he could ever become a leader, he had to go through some training. So as a servant in the household of Potiphar, he got his graduate degree in leadership, or his undergraduate. And then in prison, he got his graduate training in leadership, because I figure if you can run a prison, you can run just about anything. I have a friend who was a prison warden nearby here. And years ago, he took me for a tour inside the jail that he ran and explained to me what it took to manage a prison population. And I had an incredible amount of respect for what he did. And I figure, man, if Joseph could rise to the top in prison, and if he could lead there, he could probably lead anywhere. And what's happening as he's here in prison is that his character is getting stronger and stronger, and he's being turned from a 17-year-old spoiled kid who was hanging out at home with his daddy in his soft little robe into a man who could lead something. And here's the truth. Character doesn't come from a convenience store. See, it's in the times of pain and difficulty and struggle that God does his greatest work of developing character in our hearts and preparing us to be the people that we someday will need to be. Second thing Joseph gains from his time in prison, not only greater character, greater compassion. Now let me pick up in chapter 40. Here's what it says. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Have no idea what they did to offend him. Maybe the baker was trying to get him on a low-carb Atkins kind of diet or something like that, and nothing to that. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. Now, a little bit of explanation here. The cupbearer was the person who would always taste the food and the drink of the king before he ate or drank. That way, if there was any poison in the food or drink of the king, it would be so long cupbearer, but long live the king. It wasn't the kind of job that every kid dreamed about. You know, mothers didn't encourage their boys to grow up and be cupbearers. But because of his position, the cupbearer had a very close relationship with the king himself. And eventually that would become very, very important in the story of Joseph. Let me keep reading. Verse 4. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" Which to me is pretty amazing, because here's Joseph. He's a guy who's got plenty of troubles of his own, but he cares enough to stop and ask about what's happening in the hearts of these two other guys. And I got to tell you, it would have been very easy for Joseph at this point, disappointed with circumstances, disappointed with people, disappointed with life, to just become very isolated and to turn inward. Because when life has dealt you a blow, that's what we all want to do. We just want to focus on our own pain. We just want to focus on our own problems. We don't really care about anybody else around us, and our life becomes very small. But see, Joseph realizes that he's not the only one whose life has not turned out as planned. And so he says, "Why do you look so sad today?" And they say in verse 8, "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." To which Joseph could have said, "Dreams? Yeah, I had a dream once. Look how that turned out. Don't tell me about your dreams. I don't want to hear about your dreams. You just forget your dreams." That's not what he says. Here's what he did say. Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" Because Joseph, in spite of everything else, was absolutely convinced that God was with him. And he says, "Tell me your dreams." See, I would suggest to you that here in prison, something had been happening to the heart of Joseph. He was no longer that same person that he was at 17 years old. Because when he was living at home, he was basking in the honor of being the favorite son. And you remember that coat of many colors? He wore that fancy coat like a badge of honor. And he didn't care about the pain in his brothers' hearts who were not the favored sons. In fact, it got to the point where they hated him so much they wanted to kill him. And he didn't even notice because he was so wrapped up in himself and in his own little world. But as a slave in Potiphar's household, and now as a prisoner in this prison, his pride is being broken. His heart is being softened. And he's becoming a more and more compassionate man. And see, Joseph would need more compassion because eventually he would be the leader of a great nation, if you know the rest of the story. And the people of that nation would be faced with a severe famine, and he would need to have the compassion to do what was right for them. And someday he would stand again before his brothers, and they would come seeking forgiveness. And he would need compassion in order to really forgive them. And I believe that it was in servanthood and in the prison that Joseph learned what it meant to have compassion. I think some of the most sincere and compassionate and encouraging Christians I know are people who have suffered deeply, who've known some real pain in their lives. And on the other side of the coin, some of the most superficial and some of the most self-centered Christians I know are people who've had very comfortable lives. And they've never known what it was to really suffer deeply, because just like character, compassion can't be found in a convenience store. Compassion only comes in the difficulty. So Joseph, there in prison, he learns stronger character and greater compassion, and then this sets him up for a bigger opportunity. That's the third thing, because this prison experience becomes the very thing that opens the door for Joseph and leads to the fulfillment of that dream that he had so many years ago as a teenager. Because here in prison, some things happen that set in motion a process that brings Joseph to a great position of influence. I'll pick up again in verse 9 here. It says, "So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, 'In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand.' 'This is what it means,' Joseph said to him. 'The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer.'" Now that's the end of the God part. Now comes the Joseph part. "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing wrong to deserve being put in a dungeon." He says, "Listen, I've done you a favor. You do me one favor. Just one small favor. Just mention me. Just tell my story. When you get back in front of the king, just tell him about this guy you met in prison who shouldn't even be here, and help me get out of this place." Now the baker overhears this, and he hears how Joseph has given this wonderful interpretation of the dream of the cupbearer. So the baker says, "Hey, how about me?" Verse 16, "When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, 'I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head.' 'This is what it means,' Joseph said. 'The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh.' So there you have it." You got to give Joseph credit, though. I mean, who wants to be the bearer of that kind of news? I think if that had been me, I would have said, your dream's a little more fuzzy. I'm going to have to pray about this one some more. How about if I get back to you in 4 days? Meanwhile, just, keep your chin up. I'm sure everything will turn out in the end. He doesn't do that. He's honest with him. Do you know why? Because he cares about him. He cared enough about him to tell him the truth so that this guy would have 3 days' notice that his life was about to end, so that he could get his heart right with God. And maybe Joseph, in those 3 days, explained to him about the one true and living God. He loved him enough to speak the truth. Now here's what happens to his predictions. Joseph interprets these dreams. Anybody can interpret a dream. The key is, does it really come true? Verse 20. "Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker." That's some birthday party. "Just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation." So the cupbearer is reinstated. Now, imagine Joseph's joy at this moment. Because now the cupbearer has been reinstated, and he told Joseph that he would say something to the king, to the Pharaoh. And so now Joseph is just waiting for him to come through for him, because here's what this would mean for Joseph: no more prison. He'd be free. He'd get to go home. So he's got his bags packed. He's ready. He's waiting. Here's how chapter 40 ends, verse 23. "The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him." Can you imagine how Joseph must have felt as he waited and waited and waited? A day goes by. He's waiting for somebody to come and open the gate and say, "Hey, Joseph, time for you to go free." And he thinks to himself, well, you know what? It's only been a day. I can't expect it to happen that fast. And a few more days go by, and he thinks to himself, well, I'm sure it's just, there's red tape and there's paperwork that they have to fill out. I'm sure that's all part of it. And then a few more days or weeks go by, and he thinks, I'm sure the cupbearer's just waiting for the right moment. It's all a timing thing. And eventually weeks turn into days, days turn into weeks, and weeks turn into months, and eventually he figures out that, the guy just forgot about him. In fact, let me look ahead to chapter 41, verse 1. "When 2 full years had passed." It was 2 years before the cupbearer ever mentioned Joseph to Pharaoh. 2 years. And I got to tell you that from a human perspective, for those 2 years, it must have looked to Joseph like life was at a dead end. His last hope was gone, and he was going to be in prison for the rest of his life. But what Joseph didn't realize in those 2 years is that there was a bigger story being written. Because think about this. What if the cupbearer had immediately said something to Pharaoh? And Pharaoh would have immediately released Joseph from prison. And he would, once out of prison, immediately have gone home to his family. And he would not have been there in Egypt 2 years later when Pharaoh has a dream that needs to be interpreted by somebody who can interpret dreams. See, Joseph had to stay there in prison until just the right time, 2 years later. And I've got to think that in those 2 years, at least in the initial, weeks and months, Joseph must have prayed all the time. God, please remind the cupbearer. God, please get me out of here. God, please do something about this. And he prayed and he prayed and he prayed, and God did not answer his prayers for 2 years. But when God did answer his prayers, it was at just the right moment. And to quote that well-known country western theologian Garth Brooks, some of God's greatest gifts are unanswered prayers. And I'll tell you what, as I look back over my life, it was some of the most painful circumstances, difficult circumstances, and unanswered prayers that eventually turned out to be some of the greatest blessings in my life. In fact, I will honestly say that if God had answered all my prayers, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be a pastor today. Probably wouldn't be married to the wife I'm married to or have the kids I have. Because if things had gone my way, my life probably would have gone a whole different direction. Now, I'm not saying that when something happens in our lives, we give God a week to show us how it's all going to work out. We may not see that for months or years. In fact, we may never see it in this lifetime. The key is that we believe that God is at work. And in the meantime, in the waiting period, we simply do what Joseph did. We do what any ordinary person would do who really believes, who is confident that God is with him. And you may feel like you're in some kind of prison experience right now. And in that experience in your life, whatever it might be, maybe you're disappointed by people, maybe you're disappointed by the circumstances of life, maybe you're just disappointed by life in general. But in that time that you're in right now, in that prison, the question is this: will I judge God's heart by my circumstances? Or will I simply believe that God is with me because he has promised that he would be? Again, Hebrews 13, verse 5, God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. And so the question is, what would someone in my situation do who is convinced that God is with him? What would someone in your marriage do who's convinced that God is with you? What would somebody with your son or your daughter do who is convinced that God is with you? What would somebody with your health situation or your financial situation or your job situation do who is convinced that God is with you? Because here's what God says. Whatever situation you're in, just act as if I am with you because I am. Now, next week, we're going to come to chapter 41, and the interesting thing is this. In chapter 41, things begin to turn around, and Joseph's life really takes a big upswing. But do you know what Joseph does? He continues to do the same thing he's always done. He just does what any ordinary person would do, even in the good times, who is convinced that God is with him. But ultimately, it comes down to this. If you're a follower of Christ, the greatest example we have is not really Joseph. We follow a Savior who's been down that same road as well. Maybe you're disappointed with the circumstances of your life. Think about this. Think about living for all time and eternity, but then stepping out of eternity and into a stable. You talk about difficult circumstances. Think about owning everything there is because you created it all, but then being in a position where you don't even have a home to live in or a place to lay your head. You disappointed with people in your life? Think about pouring your life into a group of men who then desert you at your hour of greatest need. Think about being falsely accused and betrayed and eventually crucified on a cross. You see, we don't serve a God who's up in heaven with his arms crossed looking down at us and saying, wow, your life is really difficult. That stinks for you. We serve a God who stepped into our shoes, into human history, who bore our sins, who felt our struggles, who carried a cross, and who is with us, even in our most difficult times. And I believe that if we believe that with all confidence, if we're followers of Christ, it will change everything that we do. So come on back next week and we'll hear part 4 of the story of an ordinary Joe. Right now, let's stand together. Your campus pastor is going to come and wrap up with prayer.